Who is D.B. Cooper has fascinated people ever since a man calling himself by that name hijacked Northwest Airlines Flight 305 back in 1971. People have come forward before claiming they know the culprit.
After more than 5 decades of mystery, the world may finally be closer to solving one of America's most famous unsolved crimes.
D.B. Cooper, an independent investigator unraveling his infamous unsolved skyjacking, has obtained the crook's DNA. The identity of D.B. Cooper has continued to perplex investigators for the last 53 years.
On the night of November 24th, 1971, something happened above the forests of southwest Washington that should have been impossible. A Boeing 727 was flying through a freezing November storm when, somewhere in the darkness below, a man stepped onto the rear staircase of the aircraft. He was wearing a dark business suit, a parachute was strapped to his back, and against his body was a bag containing $200,000 in ransom money. Then he stepped into the darkness and disappeared. No body was ever found. No parachute was ever recovered. No trace of the man was discovered in the vast wilderness beneath the flight path. For more than 5 decades, the FBI would know him only by a name that wasn't even his, D.B. Cooper. But now, after 53 years of silence, something buried inside the evidence has begun to speak. A forgotten black tie, microscopic particles trapped inside its fibers, and genetic material that investigators in 1971 could never have imagined they would one day be able to analyze. Together, those fragments may be pointing toward a man almost nobody had ever suspected. Not the famous ex-paratrooper, not the career criminal, not the flamboyant con man whose name appeared in headlines for decades. Someone else, someone ordinary, someone who may have lived quietly for years while the entire country searched for a ghost. But before that possibility can be understood, we have to return to the night the ghost was born. It began at Portland International Airport on Thanksgiving Eve, November 24, 1971. Among the hundreds of people moving through the terminal was a man who looked so ordinary that almost nobody remembered seeing him. He approached the ticket counter and gave the name Dan Cooper. He appeared to be somewhere in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, with olive or swarthy skin, dark hair, and a receding hairline. He wore a business suit, a white shirt, and a narrow black clip-on tie secured with a mother-of-pearl clasp. In one hand was an ordinary-looking briefcase. Nothing about him suggested danger. Nothing suggested that, within hours, his name would become one of the greatest mysteries in American history. He paid $20 in cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle aboard Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. Then he walked onto the plane and took seat 18C near the back of the cabin. He ordered a bourbon and soda. He lit a cigarette and settled into his seat. For a while, everything looked completely normal. Then the plane lifted into the gray November sky, and Cooper handed a folded note to a flight attendant. She barely looked at it. She assumed it might be a phone number, something ordinary, something forgettable. She slipped the note into her pocket, but Cooper leaned toward her. His voice was calm, almost unnervingly calm. He told her she should read the note. Then he said 4 words that changed everything. He had a bomb. The flight attendant opened the note. The handwriting was neat. The message was simple. He wanted $200,000 in negotiable American currency. He wanted 4 parachutes, and he wanted them waiting for him when the aircraft reached Seattle. Then he opened the briefcase. Inside was a terrifying collection of red cylinders, wires, and a large battery. Whether the device was actually a bomb or not almost didn't matter. She believed it was real, and so did the crew, because Cooper wasn't screaming. He wasn't threatening anyone. He wasn't behaving like a desperate criminal. He was polite, calm, and controlled. He spoke quietly. He tipped the crew, and somehow, beneath that ordinary appearance, he seemed to understand the aircraft itself. While the plane circled Seattle for nearly 2 hours, Cooper simply waited. Outside the window, the city lights blurred beneath the rain. Inside the cabin, authorities were racing against time. The FBI gathered the ransom, 10,000 $20 bills. Every single serial number was photographed and recorded, a detail that seemed insignificant that night, but would become one of the most important pieces of the entire mystery decades later. The Bureau also gathered 4 parachutes, 2 main parachutes and 2 reserves. The plan was simple. Give the hijacker what he wanted, get the passengers off the aircraft, and bring the nightmare to an end. But Cooper had no intention of surrendering. When Flight 305 landed at Seattle-Tacoma, the exchange happened quickly. The money came aboard, the parachutes came aboard, and the 36 passengers were released. One by one, they walked away from the aircraft, most of them unaware of how close they had been to becoming part of one of the strangest criminal mysteries in American history. Only a handful of people remained: the pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant. Then Cooper gave them his next instructions. And this is where the story becomes truly disturbing. He wanted the aircraft flown toward Mexico City. He wanted it low, no more than 10,000 feet. He wanted the slowest safe speed the Boeing 727 could maintain. He wanted the landing gear down. He wanted the flaps set to 15 degrees. He wanted the cabin unpressurized. And most importantly, he wanted the rear air stair left operable. That request changed everything, because the Boeing 727 had something unusual: a staircase hidden beneath its tail, a rear ventral stairway that could, under certain conditions, be lowered during flight. Cooper knew that. He knew the aircraft well enough to understand how that staircase could become an escape route. This wasn't something an ordinary criminal would necessarily know. It suggested preparation. It suggested research. Or perhaps something even more unsettling: experience. At around 7:40 that evening, Flight 305 lifted away from Seattle for the second time. The passengers were gone. The cabin was almost completely dark, and Cooper was alone in the rear of the aircraft. Outside, the storm was getting worse. The crew remained inside the cockpit, communicating with him through the intercom. At one point, he asked how to lower the rear staircase. They told him to wait. He told them he would handle it himself. Then the aircraft disappeared into the darkness over Southwest Washington. Below it was a wilderness of dense forest, steep ravines, icy rivers, and mountains. Above it was a black sky filled with rain. And somewhere between those two worlds, Cooper prepared to make his final move. Then the pilots felt something: a subtle change, a shift in the aircraft's attitude, a small dip in the tail, a strange bump. The plane seemed to momentarily bow in the air. Then the warning light appeared. The rear air stair was open. It was 8:13 p.m. Outside, temperatures were well below freezing. Rain was hammering the aircraft. The wind was screaming past at enormous speed. And somewhere beneath the tail of that Boeing 727, a man wearing a parachute stood at the edge of the open staircase. For a final moment, he was still there. Then he stepped forward, and the darkness swallowed him. The aircraft continued flying, but Cooper was gone. When the plane eventually landed in Reno, Nevada, FBI agents rushed aboard with weapons drawn. They expected to find chaos. Instead, they found silence. The rear cabin was empty. The air stair was still hanging open. The briefcase bomb was gone. The parachutes were missing. And so was the man. All that remained were fragments: a few cigarette butts, some strands of hair, 2 parachutes, and one strange object lying across a seat. a narrow black clip-on tie with a mother-of-pearl clasp. Cooper had taken it off before the jump, and somehow he had left it behind. At the time, it looked worthless, just a cheap tie, an ordinary piece of clothing, something that could have belonged to anyone. But nobody inside that aircraft understood what they were looking at, because that forgotten tie would survive the man who wore it. It would survive the investigation, the suspects, and the theories. It would survive more than half a century, and eventually it would become one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence left behind by the man who vanished from the sky. The FBI launched the manhunt almost immediately. The case was given a name, Norjack, short for Northwest Hijacking. Agents spread across 3 states. Search teams entered the forests. Aircraft searched from above. Investigators questioned witnesses. They tried to reconstruct the exact location where Cooper had jumped. But the deeper they looked, the stranger the case became, because the man had disappeared almost perfectly. There was no body, no parachute, no ransom money, no confirmed identity, nothing. Investigators struggled even to describe his face. One flight attendant remembered him as having olive or swarthy skin, dark hair combed backward, a receding hairline, and brown eyes, perhaps 45 years old. He spoke quietly. He had no accent she could identify. He had ordered bourbon and soda. He had tipped politely. And that was almost all they had. A face that seemed designed to disappear into a crowd. A voice nobody could place. A name that wasn't real. And a final image of a man stepping from the tail of a passenger jet into a freezing storm. For 53 years, that was where the story ended. A man walked into the sky, and the sky never gave him back. But the strangest part of the mystery wasn't what investigators found that night. It was what they didn't find. No body waiting beneath the trees, no parachute hanging from the branches, no suitcase full of money, no confession, no grave. Nothing that could tell investigators whether Cooper had survived the fall or died somewhere in the endless wilderness. And that absence transformed him. The man who had hijacked a plane became a legend. The legend became a mystery. And the mystery became an obsession. Thousands of tips would pour into the FBI. Suspects would appear and disappear. Men would confess on their deathbeds. Families would discover strange photographs and unexplained money. Amateur investigators would spend decades studying maps, aircraft specifications, weather reports, parachutes, river currents, and old newspaper photographs. Yet none of them could answer the one question that mattered most. Who was the man standing at the edge of that staircase? Then, decades later, investigators returned to the evidence. Not to the forests, not to the river, not even to the ransom money. They returned to the one object that had been sitting quietly in an evidence bag all those years, the black clip-on tie. Under modern scientific analysis, the fabric could be examined in ways investigators in 1971 could never have imagined. Microscopic particles were trapped inside its fibers, tiny remnants of the world Cooper had occupied before he boarded that aircraft. And suddenly, the tie wasn't just a forgotten piece of clothing anymore. It was a potential time capsule, a microscopic record of the man's life. And buried inside that record was something that could change the mystery forever. The ghost who stepped into the darkness may have left behind more than a tie. He may have left behind a clue to where he came from, what kind of work he did, and perhaps, after all these years, who he really was. The first assumption was that no one could have survived the jump, and it was a reasonable assumption. Consider the conditions. A man leaping from the tail of a jet at 10,000 feet into a winter storm, wearing loafers and a thin suit, with no helmet, no gloves, no jump goggles, and no knowledge of the terrain hurtling up toward him in total darkness. The wind chill alone at that speed would have been savage, somewhere near 70 below. He had chosen, or been given, a parachute that was, in some accounts, a non-steerable military model, a canopy he could not guide, that would simply carry him wherever the wind decided. Below him lay a landscape of jagged evergreens, icy rivers, and ravines a man could fall into and never be found. The FBI's own analysts concluded, early and often, that Cooper had almost certainly died on impact or frozen in the wilderness within hours. They believed they were not hunting a fugitive so much as recovering a body that the forest had simply not yet given back. But the forest never gave anything back, and that was the first crack in the theory, the first hint that this case would refuse to behave. Within 18 days of the jump, the FBI launched a ground search of staggering scale. Soldiers from a nearby Army base swept the woods in long, disciplined lines. Helicopters thudded low over the treetops. Search planes crisscrossed the drop zone, and boats dragged the reservoirs and rivers below. They were looking for anything. A torn canopy snagged in the branches, a scrap of the $20 bills, a scuffed shoe, a body, and they found nothing. Not a thread, not a coin. It was as though the man had never touched the ground at all. The wilderness that was supposed to have swallowed his corpse had instead swallowed the entire question of his fate. That absence became the engine of the legend, because if no body was ever found, then Cooper might have lived. And if he had lived, then somewhere out there was a man who had done the impossible, robbed an airline, terrorized a crew without harming a soul, and vanished with a fortune into thin air. Ordinary Americans, exhausted by a decade of assassinations, scandal, and an unpopular war, found something almost intoxicating in the story. He hadn't shot anyone. He'd been polite. He'd left a tip. He had beaten the system with nothing but his nerve and his knowledge of a specific airplane. And then he had leapt into the storm and won. Songs were written about him. Bars named drinks after him. A small town in the drop zone began holding an annual celebration in his honor. The criminal became a folk hero, and the folk hero became myth. But the FBI did not deal in myth. They dealt in serial numbers, because the one thing Cooper could not change was the money. Before handing over the $200,000 in Seattle, the Bureau had done something clever and quiet. They had photographed every single bill, 10,000 $20 notes, each serial number recorded on microfilm, all of them beginning with the letter L, all issued through a single Federal Reserve District, and most printed in the same series. It was a marked fortune. The moment any of that cash surfaced, passed at a bank, spent at a store, or deposited in an account, it could be flagged, traced, and followed straight back to the man who jumped. The FBI distributed the serial numbers to banks and businesses across the country. They offered a reward for any bill that matched, and then they waited for Cooper's own greed to betray him. It never did. Year after year, the money simply failed to appear. Not one of those 10,000 bills turned up in ordinary circulation. No spending spree, no sudden wealth, no bragging fool cashing $20 bills at a casino. To investigators, this was maddening and revealing all at once. Either Cooper was dead and the money was rotting somewhere in the forest with him, or he was disciplined beyond belief. A man capable of sitting on a fortune for a decade or more, never touching a dollar of it, letting the trail go stone cold on purpose. Both possibilities pointed to the same unsettling conclusion. Whoever this man was, he had planned better or fallen harder than anyone wanted to admit. And then, 9 years after the jump, the money spoke. In February of 1980, a young boy on a family camping trip along the Columbia River was smoothing out a patch of sand to build a fire. His name was Brian, and he was 8 years old. His fingers brushed against something buried a few inches down. He dug, and what he pulled from the sand looked like a rotting, disintegrating bundle of paper. It was cash, 3 packets of $20 bills still held together by decaying rubber bands, weathered and pulped by years in the ground, but unmistakably money. His father contacted the authorities, and when the FBI ran the serial numbers, the room went silent. Nearly $6,000, all of it beginning with L, all of it matching the microfilm from that night in Seattle. After nearly a decade of nothing, the Cooper case had finally produced a piece of physical, undeniable proof. The ghost had left a footprint, but the footprint made no sense. The money had been found at a place called Tina Bar, a sandy stretch along the Columbia, miles from the calculated drop zone downstream, in a location that fit almost none of the existing theories about where Cooper had landed. How had a few $1,000s traveled there while the rest of the fortune and the man himself remained utterly missing? Had the river carried it? Had a dredging operation buried it? Had Cooper stashed it there himself, deliberately as a decoy? Every possibility seemed to open another door into the darkness. Geologists were called in. They studied the sand layers, the way the bills sat in the sediment, and the erosion patterns of the riverbank, but they came away arguing with one another rather than reaching agreement. The discovery that should have narrowed the search had instead splintered it further. Every answer bred 3 new questions, and the money at Tina Bar became yet another maddening, iconic detail in a case that seemed almost designed to resist resolution. The strange thing was that the ransom money had finally surfaced, but instead of leading investigators to a body, a suspect, or a hiding place, it seemed to push Cooper even farther away. By now, the suspects had begun to pile up. Over the years, the FBI would examine more than 1,000 names, and the public would offer up countless more. There was the ex-paratrooper with a criminal record and a face that resembled the sketch. There was the man who confessed on his deathbed, swearing to his family that he had been Cooper, though the details never quite fit. There was the shadowy figure with military training and a grudge, and there was the man whose own relatives came forward, convinced by an old photograph and a lifetime of strange silences that their father, their uncle, or their brother had been the man on the plane. Each suspect seemed, for a brief moment, to bring the case closer to an answer. A photograph would surface, a confession would emerge, a forgotten military record would be discovered. Someone would remember a strange conversation from 1971, and every time investigators followed the trail, only to watch it collapse beneath them. The problem was never a shortage of suspects. The problem was that none of them could be tied to the aircraft by anything harder than resemblance, rumor, coincidence, or a story that had grown more convincing with every year it was repeated. And yet, beneath all those false leads, one piece of evidence had been waiting quietly in an evidence locker. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a photograph, it wasn't a recovered parachute or another bundle of ransom money. It was something far smaller, something almost absurdly ordinary. The black clip-on tie Cooper had left behind on the aircraft. For decades, nobody knew that this forgotten strip of fabric might contain the most important clue of all. Because while the FBI searched forests, rivers, bank records, military files, and the lives of thousands of suspects, the tie was quietly preserving traces of the man who had worn it. And when modern science finally looked closely enough, the mystery began to change. The fibers were no longer just fibers. Hidden inside them were microscopic particles, fragments of the world Cooper had occupied before that night. Some of those particles appeared to point toward metals and industries that were far more specialized than anyone had expected. Suddenly, the ordinary-looking man in the business suit began to look different. Perhaps he hadn't simply studied the Boeing 727. Perhaps he had spent years around machines like it. Perhaps he hadn't simply studied the Boeing 727. Perhaps he had spent years around machines like it. Perhaps the knowledge that had allowed him to disappear into the storm had not come from a parachute course or a criminal manual, but from a workplace. And that possibility would eventually lead investigators toward a completely different kind of suspect, one so ordinary that the world may have spent 53 years looking straight past him. Each new candidate arrived with a flurry of headlines and the promise of a solution, and each one, in the end, dissolved back into the same fog that had swallowed everyone before him. The problem was never a shortage of suspects. The problem was that not one of them could be tied to the plane by anything harder than resemblance, rumor, and the strange gravitational pull the Cooper legend exerted on lonely, secretive men and the families they left puzzled behind. There was, for instance, the man from the Pacific Northwest whose story circulated for years, a former serviceman with a taste for danger and a habit of vanishing for weeks at a time. He looked, people said, exactly like the sketch. The receding hairline, the dark sunglasses, the unremarkable face that could belong to 1,000 traveling salesmen. He died before investigators could question him, and his supporters pointed to the timing, the temperament, and the way he never seemed to want for money in the years after 1971. But no fingerprints matched, and no confession survived him. When the FBI compared what little they had, the case against him evaporated like the others, leaving behind only the ache of near certainty. Then came the deathbed confessions, and there were more than one. A dying man would gather his children close, lower his voice, and tell them that the secret he had carried his whole life was that he had once jumped from a jet with $200,000 strapped to his body. The families believed. Why wouldn't they? A father's last words carry a weight that no forensic report can match. They came forward with old ties they swore matched the one Cooper left behind, with faded snapshots they held up against the sketch, with stories of unexplained cash and sudden trips, and with a lifelong refusal to discuss the winter of 1971. Investigators listened and checked, and again found the same thing. Memory is a soft and forgiving substance. A man near death may confess to a legend simply to feel, for one last moment, that his ordinary life had brushed against something extraordinary. And through all of it, the tie remained. That was the one object the man on the plane had left behind by accident rather than design. A black clip-on necktie, the cheap kind sold in department stores by the thousands, unclasped and abandoned on his seat before he stepped into the storm. For years it sat in an evidence locker, an unremarkable strip of dark fabric that seemed to offer nothing. Fingerprints had been lifted from the aircraft, but they belonged to too many people: passengers, crew, cleaners, mechanics, and none could be cleanly assigned to Cooper. The tie, though, had been his and his alone. And as the science of forensics advanced through the 1990s and into the new century, that forgotten scrap of polyester began, quietly, to matter more than anyone had imagined. Because a necktie is worn against the throat. It rides against the skin all day, catching sweat, catching stray hairs, catching the microscopic debris that a person carries through the world without ever knowing it. In the era when Cooper stepped onto that plane, no one had the tools to read such traces. But a tie sealed in an evidence bag is, in its own way, like the sealed ground of an archaeological dig, an undisturbed context, a time capsule preserving the residue of a single man on a single night. And when a team of investigators working alongside a private group of citizen sleuths who had refused to let the case die finally reopened that bag, they were not looking for fingerprints anymore. They were looking for particles. Under a scanning electron microscope, the surface of the tie revealed a hidden landscape. Trapped in its fibers were more than 100,000 microscopic particles, the ordinary dust of a life. Most of it was unremarkable: fragments of skin, textile fibers, and the general grime of 1971. But scattered through the sample were things that did not belong in the world of a mid-level office worker, which is what many had assumed Cooper to be. There were traces of pure titanium, a metal that, in that era, was rare and difficult to work, used in only a handful of specialized industries. There were particles of stainless steel, aluminum, a rare earth metal, and tiny spheres of what appeared to be titanium bonded to other elements in a way that suggested not casual contact, but a working environment, a place where such metals were being cut, machined, or fabricated. It was a whisper from the grave, and it pointed in a direction almost no one had seriously pursued. In 1971, titanium was not something a man encountered by accident. It was the metal of aerospace, of advanced manufacturing, of the chemical plants and research facilities where the future was being welded together. The presence of those particles suggested that Cooper had not been a disgruntled clerk or a small-time crook improvising a scheme. He had been, or had recently worked closely alongside someone in a high-technology industry, perhaps at a plant that built aircraft, perhaps at a factory producing titanium components for the very kind of jet he chose to hijack. Suddenly, the man's eerie competence made a difference